People are crazy, and never has that been more evident than in the stories I'm about to share with you. Stories that will have you shaking your head and wondering, what the hell were they thinking? How far would you go to collect insurance money? How about cutting off your own hand? Because in 2008, 3 men in South Carolina conspired to do just that. The entire scheme was masterminded by this man, David Player. At the time, Player held power of attorney for a man named Michael Weaver, who people referred to by his nickname, Porky. Porky was 52 and mentally disabled. While most people have an average IQ between 85 and 115, Porky's was somewhere around 54 and 65, which is considered quite low. Porky was also illiterate and an alcoholic. Because of all these limitations, Porky depended on Player both mentally and financially. The two men had grown up together, and Player was someone Porky really looked up to. But Player took advantage of that, and took advantage of his role as power of attorney by taking out several insurance policies on Porky. And with these policies, Player stood to collect a lot of money if Porky were to be killed or dismembered. That gave Player a bright idea. So he recruited an associate of his named Gerald Hardin, who was a self-proclaimed crackhead, and convinced him to cut Porky's hand off. And in return, Player would give him $5,000 and continue funding his crack habit. Hardin agreed. Player then turned to Porky, his intellectually disabled friend whom he held power of attorney over, and convinced him that if he let this guy Hardin cut his hand off, he would pay off his moped motorcycle and buy him a new trailer to live in. Given the nature of their close relationship, Porky trusted Player, so he agreed to have his hand chopped off. And one day, the 3 men are at Player's house. Porky and Hardin got really drunk, and then the men decide that now is the time to carry out the plan. So Player takes a rag and he wraps it around Porky's wrist and sort of pins it to a tree. And as he's restraining Porky's arm, Hardin takes out a pole saw, which is basically a chainsaw attached to a pole which can be extended out to cut down tree branches, and he uses it to carefully sever Porky's arm between his wrist and his elbow. Once the limb was successfully detached, Player wrapped a tourniquet around the injury, which is something he researched how to do prior to that day, and he drove the 2 men to the hospital, where he explained to doctors that they were trimming down tree branches in his backyard when they lost control of the chainsaw. One thing doctors immediately noticed is just how unusually precise the injury was. The hand was severed at a perfect right angle to the forearm and had minimal shredding of the flesh. Most chainsaw accidents are jagged, where the blade isn't going straight down, but sort of grinding into your flesh and bone at a sideways angle like this. In Porky's case, because the separation of his hand was so clean, doctors wanted to attempt to reattach it. But the men didn't bring it with them to the hospital, so Hardin was sent back to Player's house to retrieve it. Side note, they were able to reconnect Porky's hand, but it was later rejected by his body, so they had to eventually re-amputate it. Nonetheless, after the men left the hospital that day, Player began filing those insurance claims which said if Porky were to be dismembered or killed, he would receive settlement money. And it wasn't long before he collected just over $671,000. Once the money was received, he bought his son a house, built a storage unit on his property, and bought a car for Gerald Hardin. Player was able to spend nearly $300,000 before authorities caught on to him. Which brings us to how the scam was finally busted. About a year after all this happened, Player's wife was sifting through some documents in the house during a divorce proceeding and came across a briefcase. Inside the briefcase were several dozens of credit cards taken out in Porky's name, in which Player was using to pay off the premiums on Porky's insurance policies. His wife gave the briefcase to her attorney, who showed the briefcase to the FBI, and they opened up an investigation. After a trial, David Player was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Gerald Hardin was sentenced to 3 years and 5 months. Even though he was the one who actually cut off Porky's hand, his sentence was far less. Partly because he was on a lot of drugs at the time and very controllable, but mostly because Hardin was extremely remorseful for what he had done. He pled guilty to his crime and was cooperative with the FBI's investigation, whereas David Player lied, denied everything, and never showed remorse. No remorse for filing a false insurance claim, but especially no remorse for taking advantage of Porky, a man who was in his care for so many years and who was so easily manipulated. Porky was never tried for his involvement with the scam because prosecutors thought it made little sense because of his low mental capacity. It was clear to them that Player had abused his position as power of attorney and so-called friend to Porky to talk him into participating. Porky never did receive the new trailer he was promised by Player and reportedly now wears a hook where his hand should be. This story is a unique one because not only does it involve millions of dollars and one of the rarest cars of all time, but the entire scam was caught on camera without the scammer even knowing it, which I'll show you in just a few moments. The Bugatti Veyron is one of the rarest, most expensive, and fastest street-legal cars in the world, going well over 200 miles per hour. Over a 10-year period, only 450 of them were ever manufactured. 44 of those were made in 2006. Of those 44, one was owned by this man, Andy Lee House. House was said to be one of the first people in the United States to own one. Back in 2009, he was a 34-year-old exotic car dealer and paid $1 million for this prized luxury car. And one sunny day, he decided to take it out for a cruise down an open highway in Galveston, Texas, which is an island city south of Houston, right on the Gulf of Mexico. So he's coasting down the road, driving the speed limit, definitely not pushing the car's top speed of 267 miles per hour. But as he's driving, he takes his eyes off the road just for a quick moment to grab his cell phone. But then when he looks back forward towards the road again, there's this low-flying Pelican coming right at him. So he's got about half a second to decide whether he wants to save this bird or say, F the bird, I care more about my own safety and the safety of my $1 million car. Ultimately, he chose the bird. And so he swerves out of the way, which causes him to lose control of the vehicle and drive straight into the bay, which ran parallel with the highway. So now House is in the water, this beautiful, expensive car is submerged, and to make matters worse, he can't turn off the car's engine because he was getting attacked by swarms of mosquitoes and had to quickly swim away and get out of the water. The car kept running for at least 15 minutes, with the engine just gulping in salt water until it eventually died and was totally destroyed and unsalvageable. When first responders and a tow truck showed up to the scene, House seemed to be taking the whole ordeal rather well. Perhaps he was just thankful that he wasn't hurt in the accident, and after all, the car was insured. In fact, it was insured for $2.2 million, more than twice what he paid for it. An insurance policy House had bought just a few weeks earlier. So House contacts the insurance company and explains the entire story about how this was all caused by that low-flying Pelican. His insurance company, Philadelphia Indemnity, of course needs to follow up on this claim. After all, this is a $2 million policy on the line, so they better be damn sure it's genuine. So they send out not just one insurance adjuster, but rather an entire team of insurance investigators to check out his claim. The first thing they do is they travel to the scene of the crash. And one thing that sticks out to them is that there were no skid marks on the road, which was strange because once he swerved out of the way of the Pelican, certainly he would have slammed on the brakes to at least try and avoid going in the water, right? They also found it strange that once he entered the water in the car that he wouldn't turn it off, which only required him to push a button and prevent all that salt water from flooding the engine and destroying it forever. His excuse that a swarm of mosquitoes biting him prevented him from saving his $1 million car just didn't make much sense. The entire scenario was suspicious at the very least. You have this guy who buys a car for $1 million, then buys an insurance policy worth $2.2 million if the car were to be destroyed, and just weeks later, it gets destroyed? Well, the insurance company may have been skeptical about House's story, but they really couldn't prove otherwise. Until one day, the insurance company was sent a YouTube link to a video that would change everything. You see, what Andy House didn't know that fateful day of the accident is that someone was driving next to him on the highway, filming him with their phone. Not spying or anything, just a couple of guys who saw this amazing car and wanted to get it on video, and ended up catching the whole thing in action.
Look at that, dude. That will be mine one day. What is it? I'm pretty sure it's a Lambo, dude. Oh, he wrecked. Oh, shit. Oh, shit. Oh, shit. Oh, shit.
As you can see from the video, there was no Pelican. and it was pretty obvious that House intentionally drove his car into the water, and most likely left it running on purpose in order to completely destroy it and get the full amount of that insurance policy. This was the evidence the insurance company needed, and they rightfully sued Andy Lee House for attempted insurance fraud. House countersued them, demanding that they should pay out the full $2.2 million for the car. Finally, in 2014, after years of battling back and forth, House pleaded guilty and admitted to driving the rare and expensive sports car into the water on purpose in order to collect that insurance money, and in 2015, he was sentenced to a year in prison. This story has been described as being like the plot of a Three Stooges movie. 51-year-old Nicholas DePuma deliberately set his car and house on fire in order to collect on both homeowners insurance and auto insurance, but he couldn't very well tell that to his insurance company, so this is the story he went with. DePuma was in his kitchen cooking steak on the stove in multiple pans. Suddenly, the pans catch on fire because of the alcohol in the pan that he was using to cook with. He tried putting out the fires with a dish rag, but then that caught on fire too. So he drops the burning dish rag in one of the pans, takes the whole thing and throws it out his front door, because that's a good idea. And it just so happened to land in the back seat of his convertible, setting it on fire. He runs back inside to retrieve the second pan on fire, and he was gonna throw that God knows where, but then he trips over this box on the floor and the pan goes flying across the room, and then that lands on a leather couch, which also goes up in flames. He decides to go back outside to put out his car fire with a hose, but the fire is too strong and it doesn't work, and he didn't have a second hose or a long enough hose, or a fire extinguisher for that matter, to put out the fire in his house, so it just goes up in flames. I mean, this is basically the story he was trying to sell. Needless to say, investigators didn't believe his ridiculous story, and neither did a judge. DePuma ended up pleading to second and third degree attempted insurance fraud and sentenced to 5 years probation in order to pay $37,997 in restitution. In 2011, a city bus was traveling down a Philadelphia street when a taxi cab collided with it. Barely. Both vehicles were kind of just sitting in traffic, going around 5 miles per hour, maybe even less than that. When the taxi tapped the bumper of the bus, no real damage done. In fact, the impact didn't even leave a scratch. That's when 37-year-old Ronald Moore, who was just walking by, saw what he thought was a major accident, even though it wasn't. And he quickly came up with what he thought was the perfect get-rich-quick scheme. So he climbed aboard the bus, laid down across a row of seats, and started moaning and clutching his back in pain as if he was a passenger and just got injured from this major accident. Moore later filed a claim for that injury, and not only was that claim denied, it got him in big trouble. He had no idea that cameras had caught him getting onto the bus and then taped him flopping around pretending to be hurt. Moore pleaded guilty to theft by deception and filing a fraudulent report. He was fined $1,000 and sentenced to 2 years probation. This wasn't Moore's first run-in with the law. His criminal record included charges of drug possession, robbery, criminal trespass, and prostitution. This story illustrates the basic reminder that you should be careful about what you post on social media because it can always come back and bite you in the ass, especially if you're trying to get away with a scam, as was the case with this guy, Anthony Ragusa. In 2013, his life changed drastically after suffering a fall at work where he worked as an electrician. After the injury, he couldn't walk more than 15 minutes or sit down for more than a half hour without being in pain. It even hurt to bend over and tie his shoes. And that's exactly what he wrote down on his application for disability benefits, and would go on to collect more than $200,000 from those benefits. The only problem was, he was lying, and this is how he was caught. For years, Anthony Ragusa claimed that he was physically unfit to work due to the chronic pain he had because of a work injury. And for nearly 7 years, he collected check after check from the Social Security Administration to help support him. Until one day, when word got to authorities that maybe Anthony Ragusa wasn't so crippled. And all it took for New York prosecutors was to look at his wife's Instagram page, and they would see that not only was Anthony perfectly healthy, he was training to be a bodybuilder. Her Instagram page contained a collection of photos and videos of the two of them lifting heavy weights and training for bodybuilding competitions. They were even regulars at the Bev Francis Powerhouse Gym, which is this famous gym in New York for serious weightlifters. Yep, this was the man who was receiving thousands in taxpayer dollars because he was too injured to work. But it turned out he was working. Ragusa was earning money from a limousine business he owned and operated, White Star Limousines. So essentially, he was collecting two incomes. Anthony Ragusa was arrested in May 2021 for cheating the state of New York and wasting taxpayer dollars. He pleaded guilty to one count of second-degree grand larceny, was ordered to pay $200,000 in restitution to the Social Security Administration, and will be on probation for 5 years. That's it for today's scam. If you enjoy scam stories like these, hit that subscribe button because I try to post 1 to 2 times per week. So until next time, keep your eyes open for scams.